everyone. This is Nishchil Dua, and welcome to the Remote Work Summit. On the panel now, we have Matthew. Welcome to the summit, Matthew.
Thanks for having me.
It's a real pleasure to have you here. And I think we could definitely learn a lot from you, especially because you've recently written this book on the human cloud. I think let's just start with that right away. Just walk us through a quick background about what you've done so far and your experiences.
Of course. Yeah. So the human cloud, it's funny. I think people think that when you write a book, you wake up, you start writing, and it's done the next day or the next week. And it's actually been something over 5 years, and something that you say you write a paragraph, you write a couple pages, you put it out there, you adjust, you iterate. Your own journey makes you adjust, talking with other people make you adjust. And so I think of it as sort of what's been true for the past 5 years of my life, and then where I think we can be in the next 5 to 10 years. My hope for the audience when they read this is they say, wow, we have one extremely good opportunity ahead of us. One, let's not mess this up. And two, this is what the world can look like. So that's sort of a little bit of synopsis of the book. A quick sort of jump into the context behind it in terms of my personal journey. I always thought freelancing was normal. And so I'll never forget the day I learned it wasn't normal. I had prior in college, freelancing was kind of the only way that I could work a job. I couldn't do the formal internships and the 9 to 5. And so I would do market research and anything business related for small businesses. And I always looked at sort of remote freelance work as a transition. I always thought of it as, hey, I'm doing this now, and then I'm going to go get a real job. And so I did. I actually worked for the Big Four, was my big internship, and everyone was so proud of me. And I realized this is horrible. And I'll never forget sitting on that 32nd floor and being like, this is what everyone promised me was the dream and what I was shooting for. And I thought back to my coffee shop and I was like, well, that is what I should have been doing. I was working with people all over the world, working on fun projects, working with fun clients, getting immediate feedback if I was doing good or bad. But so that was sort of my big sort of gulp moment, which I would say is what led to the book is, whoa, there is this serious difference in the way I worked and the way that work was built the past 150 years. So there's a little synopsis into the book. Some of the guiding moments that happened or that formed to sort of make the book a reality. I then kind of jumped headfirst and I started creating a freelance platform, realized what it's like to actually, I'll call it own the spreadsheet, meaning building a freelance platform because it's just, so the supply of freelancers and the demand of customers. Then went to San Francisco, was early at Gigster, which was a software development platform. And what I learned there was we can literally build $1 million projects using full freelancers and a fully remote workforce. And it was one incredible experience. From there, went to Microsoft with the problem statement of how do we unlock the enterprise? Specifically, how do we get Microsoft and GE and these ginormous companies to be able to fully immerse in freelance and remote work? And then most recently, taking over the book and incubating my next company. So it's been a journey for sure. And I always think back to, 5 years ago, that normal, we're going to get there. I promise we will. And that's what the synopsis of the book is.
That's an extensive journey, Matt, especially because in terms of experience, you've gone through through everything. You've had traditional roles, you've had startup roles, you've worked as a freelancer in the gig economy. You've actually went through the entire journey of whatever needs to be done, and now you're back here and you're talking about remote work as if that's the big thing that's going to happen in the future. So, what do you think about that? Why do you think remote work is definitely the future, and what do you think is going to happen in the next couple of years?
I think it just makes sense. I love when we talk about technology in this abstract way in terms of, oh man, AI, blockchain, all these things, what do you see in the world? And to me with remote work, why wouldn't we work that way? I mean, I'm sitting here in Singapore, you're sitting in Bali. When I was at Microsoft, I was actually remote 90% of the time because that's just how I got work done. And so that's usually my answer. It's funny. I wish I could get super extensive and get geeky and talk about, the blockchain in the back end and artificial intelligence, making it all intelligent or the matching all intelligent. But the reality is remote work just makes total sense. Now, I'm not saying it's going to be 100% remote. I think that's where we can get a little bit crazy sometimes as an industry is to think that will be 100% freelance or 100% remote. In reality, I think of it as we can, not we necessarily should or will. And so there's opportunities where remote is incredible. There's opportunities where we should be 100% full-time in an office. I think one kind of interesting example is looking at the Boeing crisis, right? And thinking about the amount of outsourcing they had and maybe some shortcuts they took. And so I think in thinking about remote, number one, it just makes sense. But number two, we have to understand where we should be remote and where we should be full time. So that's my high level feeling.
No, absolutely. I agree with you on that. Is there a framework that we could follow here? Like how does a company, how does a person decide when or where to go remote? What kind of industries, what kind of skill sets can be worked on remotely and which ones cannot be worked on remotely? Is there a framework around it? Is there a way to evaluate? Or is it just something that we have to see over the next couple of years and see how it turns out to be?
Yeah, it's a great question. So to summarize, I think the tangible question is, should you go remote? I've done every single environment in terms of being remote and freelance. I've been the freelancer. I've launched companies where we used a remote and freelance workforce. I've sat in fast growth startups where we didn't necessarily run fully freelance. And then I've sat in large organizations where the product I built was 100% remote and freelance. And so I've seen it happen in every single type of environment. I've also seen it in pretty much every type of work, whether we're talking about software development, whether we're talking about accounting and finance. I think there's sort of there's no binary answer of it works here, it doesn't. With that said, there is some commonality. So generally, if you think about where to start, creative work is a pretty good place to start. So designing a PowerPoint, designing an infographic, maybe it's article writing, blog writing. That is sort of a common place to start that you see within companies. Another question, or maybe one of the questions, the reason for that is because there's that quote by Simon Sinek, right, where he says, dream big, start small, but make sure you start. Well, usually my advice is just to start small, right? Start with something that is risk-free, that is small, and if it messes up, that's okay. So that's why generally I like to say, okay, should you try it? Well, try something in the creative field first. But with that said, in terms of a framework, I think we're figuring it out, right? I think the next 5 to 10 years is going to be an amazing time of experimentation. We have companies that are above 1,000 employees that are fully remote. We have companies that are below 1,000 employees that are fully remote. And I think, there's not one secret that we can really point to. I've heard some phenomenal sort of commonalities, right? Like if you do not prepare and you treat remote work like working in the office, then you're doomed, right? So I think there's some things we can do to protect for that. One of my favorite things is just being intentional about synchronous and asynchronous communication. So for example, I moved here to Singapore purposely to understand how hard remote can be. And I'll tell you what, understanding time zones, if you talked to me a year ago when I was technically based in Seattle and then before that in San Francisco, I'd be like, oh, time zone's not a problem. Now, oh man, it is outrageous. And I'm sure you've had to teach yourself some little hacks, right? Like you have the website where you have like 10 cities, right, that are on your docket, and you're always figuring out like, okay, let's look for green and green. And there's literally no green and green between Singapore and EST. And so you learn tiny hacks. You're like, okay, I just flip AM, PM -1, and that's what time it is. So I know 5 a.m. Sadly, for 3 days out of the week, I'm going to have to wake up at 5 a.m. so that I can get a 4 p.m. call on the East Coast. So long-winded answer to basically say the framework, we're building it. Don't take it as binary. Don't take anything as absolute. But we're going to get there, so not worried.
That's very interesting advice, and I can totally relate to that because for me, time zones have become exactly like you said, kind of a hack now. I've got spreadsheets where I have all those times nailed down. That if I'm talking in EST or PST or Central Time or Australia time, then these are my slots. This is when it matches or overlaps with me when I'm sitting here in Bali, right? So I hear you completely. So I think it boils down to what your needs are. Do you need to be in constant communication and touch with your team, or can you have async conversations? If that's possible, that it's going to be more easier for you to be distributed across the world and not just probably in one time zone. So I hear you there. And since we're on the subject, your book mentions that the office is broken. What does that mean? What do you mean by the office is broken, and what are the deficiencies in our current system? Yeah,
that's a great question. So let me start with just some tangible sort of never have you ever examples, right? And the classic is raise your hand if this ever happened to you. And this is what we do in the book. We basically have 2 pages, to be honest, of never have I evers. But for me, there's 2 experiences that really, really highlight that the office might not necessarily be the best way in all situations. But so, first example, launched a offering out of one of the companies I was working at. We crushed all our numbers within the first couple months. And then the first thing that happened was the younger kid got kicked out to bring in a older leader. And so that was sort of my first guilt moment of, whoa, this is what corporate America can be like. Second example was the classic, someone does all the work, and then the director, GM, or you name it, person up top takes the PowerPoint, takes the other people's name off, puts their name on it, gets the promotion. And so these were like two guiding moments that I've personally had of, whoa, this is just not okay. And at first, I'll be honest, at first I thought it was me. Like, so before we didn't put that in the book, and I just thought of it as, that's a growing up moment, maturity moment. But then the more we talk to fellow change makers, the more that we realized these moments were common, and people had so many stories related to this kind of thing. One thing that we do bring up in the book was the classic, you're in a meeting and everyone looks to the hippo, right? The highest paid person in the room. And a decision is about to be made, and they all just look over, usually at the end of the table, and whatever that person says, they just go, oh yeah, that's so great, that's so genius. Then the person leaves the room and everyone's like throwing chairs because they're like, that was the dumbest thing. Why are we going to do this? And so I wish I could say that it was just my experience, but there's been these numerous examples of, hey, this isn't working for most cases. Now, there's obviously, we made sure to be clear, there's examples of the office working beautifully and tremendously. And coming from San Francisco, you see companies where they're like the closest family ever. You think about the PayPal Mafia, we had it at Gigster as well. And so the office can be beautiful, but for most of the time, we kind of like the classic 80-20, it can be pretty broken. And the reason that we bring up in the book is that business today is different than business yesterday. And the barriers to entry to start a company and scale a company are shattered. And so the old sort of advantage of being able to have scale, right, and being able to really push down cost and use your size as a competitive advantage is just gone. And so personally, it's funny, I actually didn't know that. To me, I would just look up and I'd be like, these companies stink and full-time employment is horrible. But then in talking with fellow leaders and change makers, I heard some hilarious stories where they were telling me, 20 years ago, they were the young entrepreneur and they would want to build something, but the large company kept squashing them. And now they're sitting in leadership and they're looking at the young startups and they feel like they can't compete. And so they're kind of jealous of me. They're like, what the heck? Like, I wish I had that, but now my luck is horrible. And so, yeah, so that's sort of the big insight for us, is that the office today was built for yesterday, and we do need to fundamentally change some of the structures.
Right. So you worked extensively at Microsoft, where you built the entire Microsoft 365 freelance toolkit. Tell us a bit more about that. Like, what's the ideology behind that? What does it really do? And how does it really help companies work with freelancers? So what's the entire story there?
Of course. So the high level is that the toolkit enables any organization, think very large usually, to be able to scale freelance across their org. And generally what happens is people say, oh, cool, so they're hiring all these freelancers. And in reality, what happens is it's a layer between the freelance platforms. Because you think sort of working with a freelancer or a remote worker, you might see all the benefits and you might say, whoa, this makes total sense, right? You get a freelancer in the building within 2 days, they're hyper relevant experts at their field. But I like to give two common examples. The first one, and I make sure usually in the crowd, I kind of butter them up so they feel like they're going to be super smart in answering this question. But the first one is, who here invites your freelancer to the daily or the weekly sprint meeting? And everyone's like, ooh, me, we do that, thinking it's a best practice. And then I go, okay, cool. You're now at risk in misclassification, and there might be a multi-million-dollar or over $100 million lawsuit in misclassification, which is what Microsoft got hit with in the early 2000s. So that's the first one of, whoa, how do you protect against that? The second one, which now people are kind of somber and they're thinking, oh no, let's not raise our hand this time, is let's say that you give a freelancer a file that has a customer email on it. You're now at risk of 4% of your global revenues because of GDPR. And so you think, wow, this has such high benefits, but there's some serious risk when it comes to security, compliance, and integration. Because that last example that I told you, you might think, well, just don't send an employee, don't send a freelancer something with an email. But what if you gave them access to a file, and in that file or a folder, and in that folder is a file with an email? So there's a lot of these enterprise controls that have to be taken account of. And so what the toolkit did is it said, all right, this is the situation. Enterprises, they need to embrace solutions like Upwork, but they need the enterprise grade security, compliance, and integration. And so who better to do that than arguably the largest productivity solution in the space? And so we took the relevant Microsoft tools and we created freelance specific tools and templates on top of that. So a quick example was the first example I brought up, classification, where you tell a freelancer they have to come to your sprint meeting. Well, what if before an employee is able to hire a freelancer, they go to your, say, SharePoint site and they take a training video or they take a training quiz and they fill out that, hey, I will not force a freelancer to go to this sprint meeting. So that's the toolkit. It was an incredible sort of, I'd say, innovation in regards to unlocking an enterprise channel to spend.
Right. So just a quick recap. It does, a lot of times enterprises do run into problems when they're working with freelancers because, like you said, misclassification could be a big problem, data security, data breaches, and more importantly, it's about compliance and making sure that the right amount of information goes out, but also protects that information internally. So those are all the challenges that, of course, the toolkit can solve if used properly. But are there a lot of enterprises out there who are actively using freelancers and platforms like Upwork and everything else? Is there a lot of interest in enterprises these days to actively go out and work with freelancers? What have you observed so far?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And I think the easy answer is it's not a question of if, but when. And so what I mean by that is, first off, let's just put ourselves in the mindset of the enterprise, right? You basically, you have three options. The first is you hire full-time. The second is you go through a consulting agency. The third is you go through a staffing agency. In those current models, 10 years ago, that worked. But what if we now gave you a reason to say that what used to take you 30 days to get talent in the building can take you 2? And to be honest, in my sort of time, I could get a freelancer in within 30 minutes because I built up the talent cloud. So number one, it just makes sense. So that's one data point when you look at the sort of unit metrics. The second data point is, what are enterprises already doing? Well, the question is really contingent talent. Like, we love to throw out words like freelance and remote, but we have to sort of talk the talk with who's relevant. And generally what happens is you have a procurement or an HR budget. And so when you talk to procurement, that's when you're using words like contingent staffing or external staffing. And so if we look at that world, it's no secret that most companies already, over half their workforce are already contingent talent. And so when we look at freelance, the answer is just, okay, we now know that over half of an organization is built, already to have external and contingent talent. Now, how do we get them to use freelance models, which is just adding on the independent contractor and going direct to talent, as well as having the remote? So the quick answer, absolutely. The sort of two main reasons are the unit economics are just revolutionary better. And then the second answer is that they're already doing that.
Got it. That was really helpful. Matt, there are a ton of freelancers who attend this summit as well, who might be listening to your interview right now. So do you have any piece of advice for them, any tips on how these freelancers, these experts, these individual consultants can actually scale their efforts, do better at their job and probably reach out to bigger and better brands to work with? So any sort of tips, any sort of insights you can offer to these freelancers who are listening right now?
I do. So I have two, I'd say, really, really, really tangible tips. The first one is take ownership. One of the biggest differences between a freelance workforce and a full-time workforce is that freelancers are all experts. Like, you are the expert. The person that's hiring you probably has no idea what they're hiring you for. And if they do, they sure as hell don't know the price, the milestones needed to get there, the comparables. And so you need to take ownership of that. A tangible way to do that is, for each offering, make sure you understand what the statement of work would be. And so that's sort of one high level thing there. Also, if you go to Fiverr, they have sort of what they call service as a product. And so think of yourself as a menu item and ask yourself, what tasks or projects can I do and turn it into a menu? Trust me, that is not commoditizing yourself. One of the biggest fears of mine, right, is the race to the bottom, the commoditization of our labor workforce. That scares the crap out of me, quite frankly. And usually that's the sort of like gut instinct, as a freelancer freaks out and they're like, no, why would I ever sort of give out my secret sauce and put my price up front and do any of that? I'll tell you from a client side, because as a freelancer, I had the same thing. From a client side, I don't know what I'm hiring you for. I have no idea. And so you need to take ownership. Part of that ownership, which is usually a gulp moment, is that it doesn't matter how much you charge. It's all about predictability. And so if you tell me it's going to cost me $2,000 and you're going to deliver it in 2 months, I would much rather hear that than you saying it's going to take $500 in 2 months, yet it doesn't get delivered on time. And so don't worry about price. Think about predictability and make sure that you are able to tangibly scope what you're doing. So that's the first one. The second one is a little more abstract, but is more going to be your long-term value, because that first one will unlock and open the door. The second one will really, really drive your long-term income. And that is being able to team yourself. So generally what happens, and this is where I'll be honest, I get just like fury and I want to yell on a mountaintop whenever you talk to someone who hasn't been a freelancer but is trying to answer this question of how do you make more money. They say things like, well, every freelancer should be an entrepreneur. And then you say, okay, what does that mean? And they're like, well, every freelancer should start hiring freelancers. And if you're a freelancer, you probably love what you're doing. Like you didn't go become a designer freelancer so that you could now go be a manager. That's probably the last of your concerns. But if you do want to have higher value income and you don't want to be sort of scraping the pavement from a business development perspective, you need to find ways to augment yourself in teams. For example, let's say you are a PowerPoint designer. What else is a client going to need? Most likely they're going to need a scriptwriter. They might need a researcher. Team yourself up with fellow freelancers like that so that when the client comes around and needs design, you're the one ready for there. So those are my two things. Number one, sort of take ownership. You're the expert. Never forget that. Also treasure your time with that one as well. If a client expects to have another hour with you, make sure they know that's $500 an hour or whatever you scope out your rate. And then the second one is really, really build your network and build yourself into teams.
Very valuable information, I think. Matt, thank you so much for that. I've already taken notes of these things, and they'll definitely be available on your speaker page as well for people to read up. That you would like to add towards the end, anything that you would want us?
Yeah, I think so. Here's one thing you can do literally right now. If it's the morning, you can do it right now. If it's night, do it tomorrow. But I call it the coffee shop challenge. And I didn't know that I did this early on. I just kind of came natural. And I'm sure the younger generations, if you're freelancing, you might be like, wait, what I'm doing is actually different and going to be the future. This is supposed to be now. But so I call it the coffee shop challenge. Go to a coffee shop and stay there for at least 2 hours and ask yourself or see what you're doing. If you're busy and you have work to do, perfect. You're in a great spot. If you don't, ask yourself why not, and then figure out how to make yourself valuable in that type of environment. So, and it doesn't have to be a coffee shop. Maybe you can go to a restaurant or something. But either way, go somewhere virtual for 2 hours. That would be my one tangible thing to do. Little homework for them right now.
That sounds interesting. I'll probably take you up on that tomorrow for sure. The coffee shop challenge.